Welcome everyone to another episode of the Shaman's Way podcast. As always, this episode comes from the teachings of our amazing friend and shaman in residence, Cricket. We hope you're enjoying these podcasts as much as we enjoy making them, and I'd like to take just a moment to ask you if you would please leave us a rating and a comment in iTunes or whichever podcast player you're listening to us from. Giving us a rating and sharing this podcast with others is the biggest way you can tell us that you like our show. Now, without further ado, on with the episode.
Welcome back, and here I am going to chat with you on the second part of Raven that I promised you last time we chatted, my constant listener. This one, we're going to talk about the mysterious and sacred raven. I know that you're likely tuning in because you have an affinity or a joy or an understanding of Raven. And I just wanted to share some of my thoughts on what I've discovered over the years. And I shared my beginnings with Raven last time we met and my incidental meeting of Raven. And so here are some of the things that I've learned because of the story that was shared with me. I looked into the Haida, the Coast Salish, the Gitsin, and the Timishiman teachings and the stories of their customs, what I've been able to glean, and their relationship with the raven. Sometimes the raven is associated not in the Haida or the Coast Salish. It's not associated with death or blackness, but in some of the European traditions that we'll talk about later, it is more associated with death and darkness. And Raven is an intermediary between us and the afterlife. So Raven is a shapeshifter. It is also associated with sorrow and with dying. And in fact, carrion birds were often the first scavengers on the scene after a death. You know, we talked about how they like their soft meat last time. And so obviously their reputation is going to be a grim one. And in some cultures they're scorned or cursed for their presence. However, for other people, such as the Haida, the Coast Salish, they have a different relationship. Their raven is loved for its wit and curiosity. And the wit and curiosity and their trickery is what colored their spiritual significance. When I went to the Queen Charlotte Islands and I was able to listen to the raven, I sat in some of the Haida places where their town hall was in the small town that is on the island and a couple of the small towns. And I touched into how the raven had a relationship with that land and had a relationship with the people. And I had never experienced the language of the raven as provocatively, as communicative, as transformative, as, how do I put it, like a familiar. When I watched a raven land on the roof and I listened to the words of the raven, it was during a ceremony or a sharing of the Haida people of a bear ceremony, and I just happened to come across this as I was driving down the road, and I was a little bit nervous to go in because, I just really want to be very respectful of space, but I felt comfortable enough to go in and to join, and the ravens that landed on the tip of the roof, which was just, 50 meters away from where we were sitting, but the vocalizations were, I could make out the words hello. It felt as though the raven was speaking to the land and the land was speaking back, and the raven was speaking to the people, because it had always spoken to the people. When I hear the raven in the city where I live, the vocalizations are different, or perhaps I don't hear them the same because I'm not in a space where they feel comfortable sitting on a perch. They're generally flying overhead, or they're sitting in tall trees in a forest, and perhaps their vocalizations are different in a forest as opposed to an open space looking out over a inlet of water. I don't know. But the vocalizations and the depth of them had a very, very different quality from what I've experienced here. So it is no wonder that they're associated with joy and laughter and a sense of mischief, because I think that the raven would talk back, if as it joins in relationship with human, it would have the relationship to talk back. So with the Haida people, they call the raven the great trickster, and the raven is boasted with the creation of many of mankind's gifts. Raven isn't considered a god, but more of an intermediary, a being which uses tricks, and sometimes they backfire, and they're a little sacrilegious, a little sacrimonious. But their tricks brought fire to mankind. They brought, in one of the stories of Raven released mankind from a clamshell, and they walked out of the clamshell naked, and through trickery with the gods, Raven was able to provide them with fire, with clothing, with tools, and so they wouldn't freeze and they wouldn't be in the darkness. Raven is given the opportunity to supply water during a great drought. And one of the other stories that is really quite amusing, if you're able to find it, is a story of the raven bringing salmon to the people to eat, but of course he had to steal it, from beaver. And when Raven had to steal the sun, he had to, there are different stories how the raven got there, but the raven became a seed that, the princess drank, and as she drank the seed went into her belly, and the belly created a baby, and the baby was born, and the grandfather doted on the baby, and, there's that, that mask, the father figure, the king figure, the god figure, the father figure, the raven being the son figure, and the raven being the personification of the mischievous child that's always seeking. And of course, the light of the universe was inside a box, 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 dot, 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 right? And then eventually Raven steals the sun and it pops out. And so that there's one of those aspects. And I think that may be the story where Raven turned black, where they cursed him to be black. I think I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that one. And I apologize if I have harmed a storyteller by sharing something that wasn't quite right. I have been able to witness many different totem poles, and I see with reverence the spiritual guardians that have been carved into them. Raven was a very common feature that I saw, and there were even some that had raven and beaver together, and of course Raven was always on top of the beaver. So the idea of the raven as a creator or as a bringer of gifts, that's not unique to North American people. Siberia also has stories and myths told of how Raven created the world. It appears that, we humans, we watch and admire the raven. As I shared last time, they're very creative. They're very social creatures. They have a sense of joy. They're one of the very few birds that fly for fun. So it is noted for its intelligence, for its ability to create things, for its fortitude, for the ability to survive in the coldest of climates. In Australia, the kookaburra is the laughing trickster. So the raven, the story of one, has a slightly different role. It is a bird of sorrow. So the raven in this takes the sadness from humanity and flies away with it. So the Australian raven's mournful call reflects the burdens that he carries. In reading the European mythology and where I shared earlier with regard to the raven being the psychopomp being the being that carries this spirits from one realm to another realm, but they're also messengers. Or they can be, shapeshifters. They can associate any form. So deities will often shapeshift into a raven, or have a raven as a consort, or raven as a spirit kin, or raven as its familiar. I have encountered Bran in my journeys, both in God form and in raven form, and have been incredibly blown away, to be really honest, meeting, especially without any context of this being, and having to do research after and think and realize who it was that introduced himself to me in my journeys was really quite an honor. And then I think, a friend of mine, Nikki, from Haven Art Therapy in Camrose, we were talking about the Morrigan and her relationship to the Morrigan, and the relationship of raven to grief, and the keening, the singing of the soulful songs. And then that brought me back to my relationship that I had researched and thought about many years ago with relationship to Odin and his two ravens, which are Hugin and Munin. And Hugin and Munin are the left and the right, or the two sides of Odin. And one of the stanzas in the Eddas that are the stories of the people, the stanza in its various interpretation simply is put that Hugin and Munin over the fields of earth fly daily, and fear creepeth upon my soul. Of Hugin lest he come not faithfully, but of Munin I have greater fear than this. And this is what Odin says about his ravens. So he's letting his ravens fly, and he is afraid that one will not come, but the other one I have even greater fear. I read a bit further, and from my perspective, on one hand, it is an active and passive roles. So Hugin is thought, which is the active role, and Munin is memory, which I thought was the passive role, just from that psychological perspective. And Odin sends these two birds off around the world at daybreak, and they return with daily news, or every different telling of the story of Odin may give you a different reason as to why Hugin and Munin were sent amongst the peoples on a daily basis. Odin, in many of the physical representations, became the raven god. Yet there's still more to this connection. Ravens aren't only birds of gore and carnage. As we pointed to before, they're exceptionally intelligent, and Odin is an exceptionally intellectual god. So when I thought about their names, and I read various ideas and thoughts from individuals who had really picked apart the relationship between thought and mind, thought and memory, and how Hugin and Munin and their names refer to their being concrete or visualized forms of thought of Odin. So in the Norse view, the self is the self, like us. We have many different parts that are semi-autonomous, so can detach from one another under certain circumstances. And these detached parts are frequently imagined in an animal form. So in our spirit kin, or power animals, or the beings that help us, the two ravens for Odin. and they correspond to an underlying character. So in Hugin and Munin, they're Odin's, for maybe what if they're intellectual and spiritual capabilities journeying outward? What if they're in a form of intelligence and curious birds that also resonate with Odin's role as a battle god or a death god? So, with my shaman eyes, I want to think about this sending forth of spiritual aspects of oneself. And how is this? This could be to, maybe I want to accomplish particular things, or in the case of Hugin and Munin, the gathering of actual wisdom and knowledge to add to Odin's already what prodigious store of knowledge and wisdom. This was a common practice by the Norse traditions and their sorcerers. So it is not unsurprising to me. It's not a surprise that Odin, the divine shaman, the divine sorcerer, was doing that as well. So what explains Odin's fear that Hugin and Munin might not return to him? And I think about myself, and I think about the soul retrievals that I've done over the years. And so this, here's Odin sending out a part of himself, so aspects of himself, or for me, when I journey, sending out aspects of myself on some quest or another. And I think the fears speak about some of the risk that these parts would become separated from another, or injuries suffered by the Hunin or Munin or the emissaries that I send would also be inflicted upon the rest of the person who sent it out. So, talking about the wounding of self, or the trancer not returning, that when we do things that are spiritual, that there are things that we need to, that maybe we need to pay certain attention to. I fear thought, lest it never come back. Think about that. I am still more fearful about mind. So instead of Munin being memory, what if Munin becomes mind? So is Odin sending his ability of thought in Hugin and mind in Munin? So is that then the journey state that you and I undertake when we listen to the sound of the drum? Is that the same thing? And here's that worry, that would be consistent with the danger that I have faced on 2-3 occasions in that state where, there were aspects of me that weren't going to return. I think that using the stanza as a riddle for the people is a way of bringing consciousness to the difference between thought and mind, and that Odin and the 2 ravens called thought and mind is already very significant. Do you equate thought with thinking? So the thought machine and mind. Mystics, since, often try to tell us the truth of what is exactly, kind of the opposite. Thinking, thought machine, and mind are 2 different things, independent of each other. So thought and mind are independent of each other. And so is that Odin story trying to tell us the same? There are, many really well-written ideas and books on the subject of the dualism of thought and mind. And you are welcome to search that out. And meditation, mindfulness, achieving enlightenment tries to an extent in that language understand the relationship between thought and mind. But where I try to understand it is that the ability to send my thought out, my mind out, this flight, the raven's flight, it is a metaphor for the journey. It is, when we use the drum is the horse which carries us. So we're in that metaphor of movement. We're in that real process of movement. And the ravens are that personification of movement out of self and into the world. It doesn't really maybe specify which world, but out into the world. It's important that there are two ravens, thought and mind. And oftentimes in our journeys, we are reminded that we are conscious in this world to an extent, as well as we are conscious in that world. I mean, there are different levels of trance. There are different levels of moving and removing and separating oneself from the physical state. There are generally palpable differences between a many-hour state of trance versus a 7-minute state of trance. One is neither better or worse. They're just different states of mind. For some, the mind is the sum of our thoughts, rather than a completely separate reality. The mind, one of the Buddhist traditions, some of the mystical traditions tell us that the mind should be clear of thought and the mind of no mind, which gives true vision, which true sight, and that sight reaches much further into time and space than our thoughts would ever be able to reach. And is this what Odin is saying? I don't know, because that's not my how I practice. My practice isn't removing the sum of thoughts from my mind, my journey, and sending my soul, my mind, my thoughts. When I journey, I want to put my thoughts aside and I want to travel with my mind. I want to travel with my psyche. I want to travel with that part of me that is conscious, present, and constantly bringing in new thoughts, new ideas, new experiences, where thoughts are, for me, that secondary narrative that happens as I journey. My thoughts remind me, I went here, I picked up this soul piece, and then I went there and I picked up that soul piece, and so on and so forth. So my thoughts are the narrative during my journey. My mind is my psyche. It is the spirit aspect of myself that journeys into the spirit world, that has the experience, that crosses that threshold, that intuitive boundary. And Raven represents that. Raven represents that relationship of the mystical and the magical. It is possible that our thoughts are going to guide us through life, and pardon me, it would, if we think about thoughts not coming back, but if it found a way through life, so thoughts doesn't come back is one thing, but the mind not returning, that's a whole other story. If your mind doesn't return, or your mind fills with you understand what I mean, is that part of the way. But are we then, if we want to get a little more existential and we want to move back into it, do we have to, in a sense, lose the boundaries of the mind in order to perceive even deeper thoughts or deeper wisdoms or deeper knowledge? And the movement of the raven constantly into the darkness, where it sits on the medicine wheel in November, coming into that place of the darkness, the losing of the light. Where a raven sits on the wheel is in that time of the beginning of the coldness of winter. So the raven in that regard reminds us of the mystery of where we sit on the wheel, where we sit in contemplation, where we revisit the balance of light and darkness is starting to take the medicine wheel. We're starting to dip deep into the oncoming winter solstice. So it brings us to that essence. It brings us to that mind of Raven being the relationship between what could be and what is. And if we think about it in terms of the trickster. And I'll touch on this for a few minutes. I know I've talked about the trickster a number of times. I think that the raven personifying the trickster is part of the joy of it, but I think it is a social commentary on the intelligence also of the bird. And we incorporate that aspect of it into our teaching of how would we go about if we had to barter, if we had to bargain. What are the myths that are going to teach us about a fair bargain or teach us about a trickery bargain? And what is the benefit of a trickery bargain? So as Raven stole the salmon away from the beaver in order to feed the people, what exactly was beaver given in return, or what did beaver then have to seek for itself in order to replace the salmon? So the stories, although we only get a piece of them, we don't get the rest of the mythology. And to take one sliver of a cosmology or a people's mythology and even think that I understand the complexity of the mythology would be incredibly and naive, and also incredibly disrespectful. I do appreciate that there are messages and there are stories and there are myths that are shared. And I appreciate the opportunity to learn from other storytellers. It helps me to put my thoughts together. It helps me to understand how our depth of self, our communication of self came about. If we didn't explore the darker side, so the Australian, the bird of sorrow, the bird of mourning, the bird of the carrion, the actual attributes of the raven, the actual attributes of the carrion bird, and that representation of ourself outside of ourself. So we put our raven, we put our trickster energy, the energy we don't quite want to admit, onto an animal or onto a being in and of itself, so we can put it out there, personify it, and go, oh yeah, actually it's okay to laugh at that part of myself, or it's okay, I'm not the only one. Look, Raven is even a trickster. Raven even tells the odd story to get what it needs. Raven, there's always something that I can share my burden of sorrow with. So we have the ability to grieve. We have the ability to cry like the raven cries, bring the Valkyries, and the Valkyries lift the dead, the psychopomp. And there are relationships that we build with stories. There are relationships that we build and we personify them in the myths that we tell. The stories of the raven, the stories of the birds are stories that we relate to, the flying above, the ability to get knowledge from that which is not just in front of us. So it gives us the long vision. It gives us the wide vision. And that is important as a people. As a people, we tend to be myopic. So if we can expand our vision to include a depth that we are unable to see with our vision, ravens, like other birds, have highly acute vision. They have different structures within their eyeball itself to perceive different light in order to perceive depth and in order to perceive speed. There are different ways of the eye being a sense of acuity and accuracy to that which is all around them. So it reminds us to rise above a situation and to see all of the sights, even the sights in the mystery, and even the sights that may be somewhat dark and dingy, or aspects of ourselves that really we need to die or we need to grieve, we need to bring forward. So Raven really can help us pick the bones of our own sorrow, help us pick the bones of our thoughts, or pick the bones of our mind, and what is it that troubles us? What is it that can move us? How is this mysterious raven going to aid us? Can we find a way to trick ourselves to unlocking our own cages, our own light within ourself? Can Raven help us to trick to open that box upon box within box, until we actually can see our own light? Can Raven teach us that? Can Raven teach us that we are worth being released from the clamshell, or released from that which binds us, or that which keeps us small, or that which keeps us hidden? And can Raven remind us to take space and come out of the darkness and into the light, and learn to clothe ourselves with our stories, clothe ourselves with who we are, clothe ourselves with how we perceive ourselves, and release those aspects which no longer serve us. So the limiting beliefs, the belief that you are not connected to the spirit world, you are not connected to the mysterious. These things are stories that we are involved in our psyche, and we believe, and it helps us to see that there are beings, mysterious beings, who teach us that we have the ability to see beyond ourselves. We have the ability to free ourselves from the shackles that we have unwittingly placed upon us, or were born within. Seeking the mysterious, seeking the ability to fly away from oneself, from the ability to bring oneself back, thought and mind, the ability to create, the ability to be resourceful. These are the things that Raven reminds us, and these are the stories that Raven has given us. How do you relate to Raven? Do you find a raven's feather? Do you collect feathers? Do you collect black feathers? Can you put a black feather in your cap? Can you put one on the wall? Can you invite a raven in some form into your life to bring some mystery? Can you do a journey using the drums or the rattles tracks that are on our site? And can you connect with the raven and find what is the story or the mystery that Raven has for you? What is the story and the mystery that Raven can share with you? What is the story that you can share with Raven that perhaps you can't share with anyone else? What is it that you can allow Raven to take from you that you need to let go of? What are some of the things perhaps that you can look through with magic and mystery, and the safety that your grandmothers, your grandfathers, your ancestors have sought similar questions, not the same questions. How can they seek the same? No one is the same. And times change. Our souls do change. We do evolve. But some of the fundamental questions still remain. Some of the wounds we suffer still remain. And if we look to our ancestors, sometimes wounding is primal, and wounds can be looked at from the point of view of our ancestors because they too shared within the primal wound. And Raven is a primal being, and Raven takes us to the primal aspects of self: food, water, fire, shelter, survival within the mystery. On that note, I lead you into your own place, your own space, and may you journey with Raven at least once, or perhaps forever. Until next time.
Thank you again for joining us here on the Shaman's Way podcast. If you have any questions, would like to make a request for a future episode, or if you're looking for other shamanic resources, including free drumming tracks, please visit us at shamansway.net. Until the next episode, be well, everyone.